Support for IPR comes from Orchestra Iowa, featuring the full symphony performing back-to-back the music of Elton John and Billy Joel at 7:30 on Saturday, February 17th at the Paramount. Tickets at orchestraiowa.com.
It's an archive edition of Talk of Iowa from IPR News. All this week, we're listening back to our 2023 Talk of Iowa Book Club episodes. I'm Charity Nebbe. We've been reading The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. The book came out in 2016. It won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and the National Book Award for Fiction. In 2021, it was turned into a miniseries streaming on Amazon Prime. The book follows Cora and Caesar, who are both enslaved on a plantation in Georgia as they escape via the Underground Railroad. But in this reality, the Underground Railroad is an actual underground railroad that transports the characters first to South Carolina, then North Carolina, and beyond. Here's Colson Whitehead reading from the first page of the novel. He was a guest on NPR's Fresh Air in 2016.
The first time Caesar approached Cora about running north, she said no. This was her grandmother talking. Cora's grandmother had never seen the ocean before that bright afternoon in the port of Ouida, and the water dazzled after her time in the fort's dungeon. The dungeon stored them until the ships arrived. Dahomean raiders kidnapped the men first, then returned to her village the next moon for the women and children, marching them in chains to the sea, 2 by 2. As she stared into the black doorway, Ajari thought she'd be reunited with her father down there in the dark. The survivors from her village told her that when her father couldn't keep the pace of the long march, the slavers stove in his head and left his body by the trail. Her mother had died years before.
That is Colson Whitehead reading from the very beginning of the Underground Railroad. And a little later in the hour, I'll be talking with 3 expert readers. But first, Makiba Lavon is not only an expert reader, she has taught the book. She is an assistant professor of English at Grinnell College. Makiba, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. And I would love to hear about the first time you picked up this novel and read it. What was your reaction?
Okay, so this is interesting because I like to teach new books in my courses just to keep things fresh and interesting for myself. And then I figure that'll help with the students. So I actually taught this book. I put this book on my syllabus before it came out.
Oh, wow.
It was coming out during the semester, and I'd heard about it. And I'm like, oh, my God, this is going to be amazing. Because like Whitehead, I, too, thought the Underground Railroad was an actual train when I was a child. And it wasn't until I got one of those, appropriate for children books that explained everything. It was probably written by Virginia Hamilton or something, that I'm like, oh, no, it was, people opening up their homes and their businesses. But it sparked something in, child Makiba to think, oh, someone's taking this actual idea and doing something with it. So I was super excited, and my students loved it. They were beside themselves when we read it in class.
Was there any tension thinking, I hope this lives up to my expectations?
Well, that's always the roll of the dice, right? It's like you put it on there, you haven't read it, and you're like, ooh, but I always tell my students, we're just going to be discovering this together. And, we don't have to necessarily like everything that we read together in class, but there's always something to be learned from it regardless. So I kind of, stem expectations by saying that. And it just so happens that, the novel blew us all out of the water.
Absolutely. Well, and it's a novel that is often categorized as speculative fiction. It's also categorized as Afrofuturism sometimes. How do you define it?
I think speculative fiction is right on the money. I get the Afrofuturism and I won't refute it. I think that there's definitely a level of fight and refusal and a yearning for something more, better in the future that, totally allows it to be, under the banner of Afrofuturism, particularly because the protagonists are these 2 Black people who are essentially fighting not just for their lives, but for their futures.
One of the characters in the book, Caesar, grew up enslaved, but he grew up in a household where there was this expectation that he and his parents would be freed upon the death of the woman who owned them. And that didn't happen, but he learned how to read when he was a child because of that. And he has one book in his possession, and it is Gulliver's Travels. And
Yes.
and that's like the original speculative fiction. I mean, that was first published in 1726. But Whitehead has also said, that his Underground Railroad is sort of like Gulliver's ship. When they leave on the Underground Railroad, they're untethered from time and space, and so they can travel to places that don't necessarily line up historically.
Yeah, there's a bit of magic to it, right? It's underground, there's so much about it that people don't know. You kind of only know, like, you're a part of it. You don't necessarily know where you're going. There's a sense of adventure. Also, like, who doesn't love Gulliver's Travel? Like, I was obsessed with that book for my entire childhood. There's something about the possibilities that we get from it that are just so magical.
So I find it fascinating that the beginning of the book takes place on this plantation in Georgia. And of all of the fiction that I've read that portrays the lives of enslaved people, this felt the most real to me. I don't know. Did you have that feeling?
I did have that feeling. I think the only thing I can think of, like, a few that were similar, like the Book of Night Women. There's a book by Nalo Hopkinson called The Salt Roads, which is also very speculative, that has like a similar feel. It's the evocation of emotion, I think, right? What I really appreciate about what Whitehead does with this book is that we get so much of the interiority of the characters as they're going through, all the things that are happening. And I think that allows you to really tune into the emotion of what's going on, regardless of what's happening, right? Like, you get the humanity of the characters.
Yeah, and one of the things that was really driven home for me in this portrayal is, I mean, the brutality of slavery, but also how every enslaved person is living with this trauma, not only their, generational trauma because of what has happened before, but also living in fear, dealing with physical injuries, constant abuse. I mean, we think about Cora's headaches, and I was thinking about, chronic traumatic head injuries and how we know how that affects people now. And of course, at that time, nobody was thinking about the long-term consequences of beating people mercilessly, but he just made that so real.
Yes, it's a very tangible. It's like the difference between, reading about PTSD and actually, like, witnessing it, right, or feeling it for yourself. And I think that's part of what we discussed in class. Like, it's so powerful to think about and feel alongside these people whose lives are essentially discounted, right? I mean, they're made into assets. So it doesn't matter physically what they're going through as long as they can remain capital.
Right. As the hour goes on, we'll talk about the different stops along the Underground Railroad and what we learn from those after they leave that plantation in Georgia. That's where things get a lot more speculative, although every experience that they have, even though it wasn't necessarily historically accurate for the time that they lived in, it was all historically accurate. These things really happened to Black people in America. I'm curious, from your perspective, what do you feel makes this book so powerful?
So I think so many of the students didn't necessarily understand the role that enslavement has in, our economic realities, even today, right? And I think part of what Whitehead does so well is that, you can't read this book and walk away not knowing that this country exists the way it does because of the ways that enslaved people were treated, right? Because enslaved people were turned into capital. So it's a very real, meaty examination of what it means to live in a racially capitalist society where you cannot escape the racism that is entrenched from our economic realities as a supposed democratic institution.
Yeah, there's a line that repeats so many times when Cora asks who built the Underground Railroad, and
yes,
and they say who builds everything in this country.
Who builds anything, right? Exactly. And he really gets at the heart of that.
Yeah. Watching your students experience this book, I mean, you had read a lot of other fiction and a lot of other nonfiction that introduced you, I'm sure, many times over to all of the concepts that were in this book. But I have to imagine it was new for a lot of your students. What was that like?
It was actually really amazing. As soon as y'all asked me to do this, I'm like, oh man, I should add this back to my syllabus because I think there's so much of what they're getting in other classes, some of the things they've experienced in their own lives, that became really clear for them reading this, especially because we were reading the book alongside, historical accounts of the things that actually are mentioned, like the Tuskegee syphilis study and sterilization of Black women, right? The rise of gynecology, the destruction of Black towns like Wilmington and Tulsa. So illuminating for them that, like, yes, this is fictionalized, particularly because, as you say, these things were spread out beside the time that Whitehead chooses, which is, the 1850s. So he's dealing particularly with, like, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, but he references a lot of things that happened either before or after the time period that he chooses. But reading that actual historical account alongside the novel really entrenched all of these things within them and, how we are living through the reverberations of those today, as Saidiya Hartman says, the afterlives of slavery.
Makiba Levon, thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you.
This is Talk of Iowa from IPR News.
Support for IPR comes from Orchestra Iowa, featuring the full symphony performing back-to-back the music of Elton John and Billy Joel at 7:30 on Saturday, February 17th at the Paramount. Tickets at orchestraiowa.com.
Black perspectives haven't always been centered in the telling of America's story. Now, we're taking center stage. Introducing NPR's Black Stories, Black Truths, a collection of Black-led stories from NPR's podcasts. Search NPR Black Stories, Black Truths wherever you get your podcasts.
This is an archive edition of Talk of Iowa from IPR News. This week, we're listening back to our 2023 Talk of Iowa Book Club episodes. I'm Charity Nebbe, and we've been reading The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. The book came out in 2016. It won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and the National Book Award for Fiction, and it follows Cora and Caesar, who are both enslaved on a plantation in Georgia as they escape using the Underground Railroad. But in this fiction, the Underground Railroad is an actual underground railroad that transports the characters first to South Carolina, then North Carolina, and beyond. And three more expert readers are now here to join the conversation. Reverend Ray Dial is a retired educator and current pastor at Bethel AME Church in Iowa City. Hello, Ray.
Hello. Good to be here.
It is wonderful to have you here. And I asked you to read a novel. That's not normally what you spend your time doing. So tell me your reaction to this book.
Well, it's interesting because I rarely read fiction. I think this is probably the fourth fiction that I've read in 10 years.
Wow.
Because when you preach and teach, you kind of don't get to use a lot of fiction. But it was interesting. I guess it's, I'll use a yogiism, for something to be untrue but real. So that part was interesting, but I try to stay away from fun because of the subject matter. It is hurtful when you get into it,
Yeah.
and but interesting and necessary.
Yeah, the speculative nature, does that give you a little bit of an emotional distance because there's stuff happening that is not entirely based in reality?
And while that's the case, having the Black American experience is that it's always real in your everyday life, and having been born in Alabama, and I'm old, so I remember talking. My great grandfather was enslaved, so talking to my mother about his experiences, and just recognizing the fact that there probably isn't a Black woman in America whose ancestors have been here since before enslavement ended that wasn't either raped or in some way sexually assaulted and had to deal with that to survive, and then not tell her husband or significant other, because if you tell, then they either have to lose their life defending your honor or never look you in the eye again because they didn't. So in that sense, it's a good and necessary read, but not a fun read.
Right. Yeah. Really, really tough. Tara Bynum is also here, assistant professor of English and African American Studies at the University of Iowa and author of Reading Pleasures, Everyday Black Living in Early America. Tara, welcome.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, thank you so much for being here. And this was also your first time reading this novel. Tell me about your reaction.
It was my first time reading this book, and I've heard about it, certainly. And I think it was definitely an interesting read. I think I was struck by kind of Whitehead's exploration of the Underground Railroad and thinking of it as an actual kind of physical structure. I think that I wrestled a bit kind of with the arc of the story, trying to make sense of the work that Colson Whitehead wanted to do with it. And so, yeah, I guess I'm excited to have our conversation today to talk more about it.
Absolutely. And I've said this before, but we don't all have to agree on everything. So I can't wait to hear your thoughts. We also have Abena Sankofa Imhotep with us. She is an author and executive director of Sankofa Literary and Empowerment Group and Sankofa Literary Academy. Abena, welcome.
Hi, Charity. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful to talk to you. And give me your first impressions of the book.
Well, I was intrigued by another story that allows readers to reimagine enslavement. And I grappled with a lot of things in the story. I initially went into the story thinking, oh, gosh, another slavery book. But the opportunity to reimagine and retell history as a real formation rather than, the Underground Railroad as we have come to know it. It was very interesting to me. So I'm happy to be able to talk through this book with everyone today.
So I'm curious from each one of you, and I'll start with you, Abena, mixing history, because in the beginning of the book, we first imagine what it was like for Cora, the main character of the novel, for her grandmother to be captured and enslaved and brought across the ocean. And then we really dig into life on this plantation in Georgia. So thus far, the narrative is very much historical fiction. And as things depart from historical fiction and gets more into the speculative part of the fiction, was that uncomfortable for you at all, Abena? Did you feel unsettled because we were mixing reality, real historical facts, with this fanciful story?
No, I don't think it was necessarily uncomfortable for me, but it was actually a necessary point of departure, because we're able to reimagine enslavement in this kind of futuristic way. It allows for the full spectrum of not just Black humanity, but Black creativity. Black authors don't only have to write about history. We can write about many, many things. And I think Colson Whitehead does a fantastic job of displaying the creativity of a free Black man who is able to write what he wants to write. So the book is an examination of not only enslavement through a historically fictional lens, but in my perspective of the possibilities of class distinction on a plantation, which you can really only examine through the lens of someone who is allowed to be creative, who is free to be creative.
It's interesting. You mentioned the class distinction on the plantation. I've listened to a number of interviews with Colson Whitehead, and he has spoken about how in his depiction of the plantation, he wanted to have fully realized human beings. He says, with so much of this historical fiction, the enslaved people are reduced to stereotypes in many ways, or we have the urge to make sure that we only see the good in the individuals who were enslaved people, and he wanted a fully realized spectrum of humanity on the plantation, and also to recognize, as we were talking about earlier, how incredibly traumatized these people are and how that would affect their behavior and their choices. I mean, Tara, what were your thoughts in reading about the plantation life?
I think that what I actually wanted more of was the people. And also the people in the place. So I think there were times when I was left wondering, like, where in Georgia are we? And if that's not a good kind of orienting question, then what work is not knowing where we are in Georgia doing? And I think that there were also times when I guess I was keenly aware of Whitehead's bibliography, like the secondary sources that he had been reading.
You've read a lot of those
yourself.
Yep.
I said, okay, like this is certainly well read and well researched, but I almost wanted there to maybe be like more interest in like who they are. I guess I was still left wondering, like, who is Cora? Who are the people on this plantation? Because they still seemed to be defined so much by the plantation experience.
Okay.
And I think maybe aside from the garden patch that Cora kept, like I guess I longed for more of the character development because I thought that there was, because I think that there was so much focus on like making sure there was the right level of historical accuracy, but I guess I wanted the historical accuracy with a bit more depth of character.
What about you, Ray, in reading about the plantation in Georgia?
It was interesting to help people understand that there was more than just the person, the house, and feel. That within the house you can have a hierarchy, and enslaved people in the field you can have a hierarchy, and the psychology of oppressed people becoming oppressors. And as I'm reading it, I'm thinking about, this sounds like Solomon Northrop. This sounds like Josiah Henson. This sounds like, and so recognizing all of those things in there and seeing the female character be the main character, which is most of the time you don't have that in some of the original narratives, and just watching the ebb and flow of her life and her hopes and expectations. But it was good to recognize that oppressed people can become oppressive because of their oppression, the hate that hate produces.
Right. Let's talk about Cora. And Ray, why don't you go first? I mean, we know that Cora was around 17 years old or so-ish in this story, at the beginning of the story. So she was a young woman, but of course, childhood was not something that was respected among enslaved people. Her mother had left and run away to try to seek freedom when Cora was around 10 years old. And so her mother, Mabel, was gone and was a legend because she had never been found and never been brought back to the plantation. So we have Cora, who is very much alone, trying to make her way in the world. And she gets relegated to living with a group of women who are, I guess, sort of characterized as being mentally ill, the women who can't live with the other people on the plantation. So tell me what you think about Cora.
Understanding or dealing with her character was difficult for me because my mom's name is Cora. So the entire time I'm thinking, okay, well, and because even though I was born in Alabama, my mother was born in Mississippi in 1929 in a little town. So recognizing that she would have had to deal with all of those kinds of things. Obviously, enslavement didn't exist at the time, but freedom didn't either.
Right.
And as a matter of fact, she told me how she and her sister had to go from their little town, Pachuta, about 12 miles away to Meridian to go to high school because Pachuta, the school stopped at 6th grade, and it was actually a school that her grandfather had built. So as I'm reading this character, I'm picturing people in Pachuta, and I'm trying not to get angry, recognizing that this is happening, but I'm also intrigued by her wit as she moves through life and chooses opportunities to say things that are deep cutting, recognizing that anytime you say something that can be offensive to your oppressor, you can or will get hit. But also watching her recognize the little courtesies of turning your back while she gets dressed. Remember when I read that part, I said, just think about, I don't like having to take my shoes and belt off at the airport. And here's somebody that has to...
She's never had any privacy in her entire life.
She can remember the first time that men chose to turn their back as a sign of respect, and that was something, just watching her absorb all of that and knowing that she represents hundreds of thousands of women.
Yeah. Well, and I know that in asking you to read this book, I was asking you to do some emotional labor, and I didn't know, of course, about that connection. So,
and I didn't until I got to the first pages.
Book. Wow!
But it's our family has never shied away from these kinds of issues. Part of what got us from Mississippi and Alabama to Los Angeles, where I grew up, were these kinds of issues. Her older brother was a principal at a black high school in Mississippi and helping students go away to college, and the white people of the town resented it, so they set the school on fire, blamed it on him, and so he spent 23 days in jail, then they let him go, and I'm reading some things about to get out was like, whew, you didn't get killed, but then that was the end of his teaching career. My oldest aunt was actually an English teacher in the school. So it was, so I'm reading this, and so it brought it alive. But that's why I think it's important when people read it, and we may have to smuggle it to Florida or somewhere.
Or Iowa, right.
Yeah, pass it around in a paper bag because it brings it alive and lets people know she's real, the women she interacted with were real, and then seeing the psychology of people who are saying, how do I survive my oppression? We used to talk about as kids, that's why people played the dozens, because they were trying to get some sense of, I am somebody, and one of the ways that they sometimes had to do it was to look down on other people.
Right. The dozens is kind of a playground game where you insult each other.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Abena, what did you think of Cora?
I thought Cora was amazing. I honestly was rooting for her as soon as she stepped into the narrative. This is a girl who is othered in so many ways. She's subjugated by the fact that she is Black, by the fact that she is enslaved, by the fact that she's female, and then also that she's considered crazy and has to live separately. And all of these distinctions, within all of that, she is able to remain connected to her ancestral legacy, the legacy of her mother, and that longing and for connection to her mother and her grandmother. Those connections stayed with her throughout the narrative. And so I thought Cora was a hero, and I was rooting for her the entire time.
I want to talk more about those ancestral connections in a moment, but we do need to take a short break. We'll be back in a moment to talk more about The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. With me this hour, Abena Sankofa Imhotep. She's an author and executive director of Sankofa Literary and Empowerment Group and Sankofa Literary Academy. Tara Bynum is here, assistant professor of English and African American Studies at the University of Iowa, author of Reading Pleasures, Everyday Black Living in Early America, and Reverend Ray Dial. He's a retired educator and current pastor at Bethel AME Church in Iowa City. We'll be back in a moment.
Black perspectives haven't always been centered in the telling of America's story. Now, we're taking center stage. Introducing NPR's Black Stories, Black Truths, a collection of Black-led stories from NPR's podcasts. Search NPR Black Stories, Black Truths wherever you get your podcasts.
This is an archive edition of Talk of Iowa from IPR News. As the year comes to a close, we're listening back to our 2023 Talk of Iowa Book Club episodes. I'm Charity Nebbe. We have been reading The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. The book came out in 2016. It won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and the National Book Award for Fiction. It revolves around a character named Cora. She's at the center of the story. And in the beginning of the book, she's enslaved on a plantation in Georgia, and she escapes with the help of Caesar, another enslaved person. They escape using the Underground Railroad, which in this reality is an actual underground railroad that transports the characters first to South Carolina, then North Carolina, and beyond. And with me, I have three expert readers in the studio. Abena Sankofa Imhotep is here, author and executive director of Sankofa Literary and Empowerment Group and Sankofa Literary Academy. Tara Bynum, assistant professor of English and African American Studies at the University of Iowa and author of Reading Pleasures, Everyday Black Living in Early America. And Reverend Ray Dial, a retired educator and current pastor at Bethel AME Church in Iowa City. And just before the break, Abena, you had brought up Cora's connection to her mother and to her grandmother. And we see her reflecting on the choices that she makes and how in one moment she is doing what her grandmother would have done. In the next moment, she is doing what her mother may have done, and thinking about those connections. And I feel like Whitehead was really, really careful in crafting that connection and demonstrating that Cora is not just shaped by her circumstances, does not just spring from the earth of Georgia, but has a lineage. So, Tara, I'd love to hear your thoughts about that and why that may or may not have worked for you or been important.
I think that Cora as a character is certainly compelling. And I kind of often wondered, like, how she saw those kind of connections between her mother and grandmother. So, I think we're introduced to both women. And yet, I guess I'm the one in this call, in this episode that's kind of longing for
wanting more.
Yeah. And I think that is also something that I wanted more of. And, I guess I say that as someone who has a true investment in thinking about kind of the interiority of Black people in centuries past. The 18th century is my favorite century, the 19th, not so much. So, I think that in kind of reading through this fictional model of like thinking about this particular history, I think that there were moments where I wanted the fiction part to do that much more work for me, And I know that I'm one reader and I'm also not the author of this book, but I guess I wanted there to be an even more clearer through line between Cora and her mother and her grandmother. Not just that what they have in common is that Ajari ends up enslaved, and as a result, they emerge as Ajari's lineage. But I guess I wanted there to, even in thinking about Caesar picking Cora as his running buddy, I think that was an interesting moment. I guess I wanted there to be a deeper exploration of why, other than like, oh, Cora's going to be lucky because Mabel made it, right, or so everyone thinks. Like, what does that actually mean? What about Cora suggests luck? Is that what makes her life at the Hob important? The fact that she is kind of cast out, like, is it these moments where she bucks authority that is compelling to Caesar or even to herself, So I admittedly am as I said, the one who is longing, but I wanted there to be more.
I always wondered, too, how much of what was passed down in each generation to her about freedom to even know that that's something you ought to want. And then over the generations, how much of it dissipates and that you really don't know what it is so that you're afraid to even want it. And is it something that she said or the way that she said it that allowed Caesar to think she has the fortitude to do what I can't do by myself, and I believe that she can. So it was that thing that was missing, but I was always interested in how do you explain to someone that's never been free? And as she goes through life talking about seeing the other side of the trees for the first time, or a tall building for the first time, and being able to look at the stars differently, those kinds of things, it would have been interesting to have more of that.
Right. Well, you talk about freedom, and I think that, obviously the different themes about freedom are in every chapter. And one of the things that I found really interesting, so they escape through the Underground Railroad, and their first stop is South Carolina. In South Carolina, they have many more freedoms than they had as enslaved people, but they're not really free. They are, most of the people, they live in boarding houses. Most of the people that they are living in with are actually owned by the state of South Carolina. They are getting the opportunity to be educated, but they're also put on display, and they are also being, we find out, experimented on, and women are being sterilized. And of course, these are all things that really happened in American history, not in 1850, but happened in American history. And that's, of course, a big part of what Whitehead is showing us. But I found it so fascinating that Cora and Caesar didn't want to leave. So they had found this place, and they could go on to seek more freedom, but they felt safe, and they felt like this was maybe as good as it could get. Ray, what did you think about when you were reading that? Because I really wanted them to leave.
It's kind of they got to a point where they recognized the known evil that they left and the lesser evil of where they were, and the unknown can sometimes more fearful for people, and we even see it in people today. You meet people who, something as simple as, I'm not going to try that food. It looks funny. So trying to appreciate, when I would teach Black Studies, reminding high school students that there's more to running away than just leaving. It's a fear of the unknown, and that's why more people did not. So looking at it that way, but it was interesting watching them wrestle with that, because he understood more about it and what was out there. But for him to be satisfied stopping there, and then I'm at the same time, because of politics, I'm thinking, how different are the Carolinas now?
Well, I mean, I'm sure that was intentional, because we believe ourselves to be free, but are we? Tara, you look like you have something you want to say.
Well, I think that the impulse to stay in South Carolina also, kind of felt to me like a comment on, what it means to make home. I guess I wasn't necessarily thinking about whether or not they should keep going. I think once I kind of bought into the Whitehead universe that was constructed here, I think that it seemed like an important choice to make, an important choice to kind of, think about what it means to have escaped, have made it, have kind of made it through the hardest part that they know of. So I guess for me, like, just thinking about it in sort of, the novel's own time frame, I think that, sure, that some of it might be that there's an unknown that they don't want to walk into, but I think there's also the reality of what they've accomplished. And I think that we can't necessarily toss that aside or cast that aside for, a further off utopia that may or may not exist within the kind of universe of this book. So I guess that's what I thought of first, that, Cora as Bessie had figured out how to make home, and kind of to make home yet again, and to know that she was capable of doing that outside of the kind of very limited plantation setting in Georgia.
I had to keep reminding myself, too, that was the North, if you're coming from Georgia.
Right.
And not comparing it to being in Canada, but to not being on that plantation, and even now recognizing, I think Carolinas and Georgia, southern states, I have a different mindset than if I think about Oregon or Washington or California. So it was interesting.
Well, I want to jump ahead a little bit. There are so many moments in this book that do illustrate different parts of American history. They spend time in North Carolina, and we do see, so many elements of, again, Black culture, Black societies being destroyed, and Black people being murdered. I want to jump ahead to Indiana. And you mentioned Utopia, Tara. In Indiana, Cora finds herself on a farm that is owned by a man named John Valentine, who is a Black free man, but his skin is very light, and he uses his ability to pass as a tool to build a safe place for enslaved people who are seeking freedom, and other Black Americans who might gather there. So this was a little, it was almost a communal farm. It is a communal farm, not a utopia, but it gives us an opportunity to explore a lot of interesting debate that, again, has happened in the United States and continues to happen in the United States as to how to create a better future for Black Americans. Abena, tell me what you thought about the farm in Indiana.
I think the farm speaks to, again, the geography of our identity, which is truly one of the themes that I was able to pull out of this novel. Is our identity is informed by where we are. And kind of circling backward a little bit to Cora and the garden that she inherited from her mother and her grandmother. So using the land as a mechanism with which to reach back to your home, not necessarily that home is a geographical place, but that home is something that is given to you and in you, and you take it wherever you go. I feel like Indiana was another point at which Cora could say along the journey that wherever I plant my feet, I'm at home. Because yes, although geography informs our identity is formed by what we are thinking and what we pull from cultural identity wherever we plant our feet.
That farm was not a safe place. There's no safe place in this entire book, which I mean, that was incredibly intentional, again, by Colson Whitehead to point out that there is no safety. And so many of the people who sought freedom never found it. I mean, Ray, the whole book keeps you in fear. And that was on purpose.
Yeah, and to know that collectively, well, thinking back to Valentine, when I'm reading and he's buying land for other people, and in my mind I'm knowing that you can get away with that one time. Because when you go back, like, wait a minute, we just sold you some land, but also recognizing the issue of skin color. And he was only able to do what he did because of the color of his skin, and then having relationships with the other people on the farm, which really, there's more freedom. Or is it just that the gate that keeps you in is farther away, and so you can look farther before you see the fence?
We only have about a minute and a half left, and I would love to hear from each of you why you think this might be an important book to read.
I think that this would be, the teacher in me in thinking about this book. I think it would be an important book to read alongside of primary sources, and to maybe think a bit more about like what real people did and how real people made home, whether safety was their priority or not. So I think that's kind of what I'm sitting here imagining. Like, this book, I think, would work well alongside so many other kind of primary source documents that might help my students think more fully about those lived experiences.
It would start a lot of good conversations.
Yeah.
Abena, why do you think this would be an important book to read?
I absolutely love this book, and I think it's important to read because one of the characters that is unnamed but interwoven throughout is allyship. Allyship is a character in this story, and it's given locomotive power by making the Underground Railroad a real thing. So it begs us to ask questions. What would happen if we interrogate the system of the Underground Railroad and give it systematic implementation of allyship? Give it arms and legs. What could happen? And is that a key component that's missing in our movements today as far as Black advancement? Or is allyship given locomotive power? Is it given arms and legs? And then how much more powerful would our movements be to counter the present political and social actions if we were able to do that?
Ray, you get the final word.
As a non-writer, I could see it as a teaching tool where you can help students to understand you can't write this unless you have read primary sources. And you probably would have read 20 different research things in order to generate this. So I could see it motivating someone who wants to do something like this to have to do the other. And I'm glad that I had to read some fiction, and who knows, maybe I'll pick up another fiction book before 10 years pass.
Oh, thank you all so much for talking with me and for reading with me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charity.
Reverend Ray Dial is a retired educator and current pastor at Bethel AME Church in Iowa City. Tara Bynum is assistant professor of English and African American Studies at the University of Iowa and author of Reading Pleasures, Everyday Black Living in Early America. And Abena Sankofa Imhotep is an author and executive director of Sankofa Literary and Empowerment Group and Sankofa Literary Academy. Special thanks to Prairie Lights Bookstore in Iowa City for providing books for our readers. This episode was produced by Caitlin Troutman. I'm Charity Nebbe. This is Talk of Iowa from IPR News.